The dust over Kettle Ridge turned red that afternoon. Not from the earth, not from the season. From something older, the particular color shame takes when it bakes long enough under Montana sky. Somewhere beyond the tree line, cattle moved through dry sage. A hawk held its position over the ridge without effort, reading the air below, with the patience of something that has never once been in a hurry. The town square was packed. 300 people standing shoulder to shoulder between a general store and a saloon. All of them watching the same thing. Nobody speaking. Nobody moving. Just watching the way people watch when they know what they are seeing is wrong and have decided for now to let it be wrong. At the center of it all stood a man in chains, and then a woman stepped forward. The dust turned red that afternoon. Not from the earth, not from the season, from something older than either the particular color shame takes when it bakes long enough under Montana sun. Clara Hadley stood at the edge of the crowd and told herself she was only looking. That was what she'd been telling herself for 20 minutes, while Sheriff Marcus Doyle read from his paper in that flat, bored voice he used for cattle auctions and court orders, and anything else the territory required him to announce in public. She was only looking. She was not going to do anything. She had $85 in a cloth bundle at the bottom of her purse, and that money had a name on it already, had been spoken for before she ever set foot in Kettle Ridge this morning. And what happened in this town square was none of her concern. The man at the center of the square made the crowd step back without moving. That was the first thing she noticed. Not his height, though the height was impossible to ignore, built past any doorframe she had ever walked through. The kind of size that doesn't register until you're standing next to it and realize your understanding of scale has been wrong for your entire life. Not the chains, though the chains were there, iron cuffs that had carved themselves into the skin at his wrists, until the flesh had given up arguing and simply wept. What she noticed first was the stillness. 300 people packed into the square between Dill's Mercantile and the Silver Spur Saloon, noise coming off them the way heat comes off summer-baked earth. And this man stood in the middle of all of it like he was somewhere else entirely, like he had practiced, over a long time, the art of being present in a body while sending his mind somewhere they couldn't follow. His eyes moved, though. That was the second thing. They tracked the crowd in slow, deliberate sweeps, and she understood without being told that he was making a record. Who spat, who looked away, who stared with something that might have been pity, but would not become action when it mattered. He was cataloging them, filing them away. Doyle cleared his throat and raised his voice for the people in the back. Court-ordered labor settlement, folks. Caleb Ironwood here owes damages of $85 to the Thorn operation for theft of 4 horses. He's got no means of payment, so the courts made his 2-year labor contract available for purchase. $50 opens the bidding. Strong back, good with animals. Somebody's getting a deal. He said it the way a man says livestock auction. He said it the way he might say gelding, 5 years old, good teeth. Clara's hand found the cloth bundle at the bottom of her purse, without her deciding to put it there. She was not going to do anything. On the porch of the Silver Spur, leaning against the rail with the particular ease of a man who has never once stood somewhere he wasn't welcome, Augustus Thorne watched the proceedings with a cigar between his fingers and an expression that was technically a smile. He was 45, and he wore it well, the way expensive things wear their age. The gray at his temples looked chosen. His vest looked like it had been stitched by someone who understood the difference between clothing a man and declaring his position. He had not bid on the labor contract. The 85 belonged to him by right, the settlement for his 4 stolen horses, and yet his hand stayed at his side and his cigar kept burning, and his eyes kept moving between the chained man in the square and something else. Some calculation Clara couldn't read from where she stood. She thought about Thomas. She did that sometimes, in crowded places when something was happening that Thomas would have had something to say about. He'd have had something to say about this. Thomas Hadley had opinions about most things, but he had particularly strong opinions about watching and not acting, which he considered the same sin in 2 different clothes. 3 years now, 3 Octobers, and she still turned to say things to a man who wasn't standing next to her. Doyle was still talking. Someone in the crowd offered 55, and someone else counted with 60, and the man in the chains stood in the middle of all of it and did not look at either bidder. He was looking at the far edge of the crowd. He was looking at her. She didn't know how long he'd been looking at her. Long enough that when their eyes met, she felt caught at something, though she hadn't done anything yet. His eyes were dark and still, and held no particular expression, not pleading, not hoping, not performing anything for her benefit. He was simply looking at her the way a man looks at something he's trying to understand and isn't sure he ever will. The bidding had stalled at 60. The cloth bundle was in her hand. Clara Hadley pushed through the crowd. She was 5'4" on a good day, and the crowd was packed 3 deep in every direction. But there is a particular quality to the movement of a woman who has decided, and the crowd felt it before they saw it, and made room in the way crowds sometimes do, not graciously, not consciously, but the way water parts around something that is simply going to move through it regardless. She heard the whispers start behind her. She felt 300 pairs of eyes shift. She kept walking. She stopped in front of Sheriff Doyle and she said, "Don't hurt him." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. $85. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Doyle stared at her. His mustache twitched. Behind her she heard Hortense Pruitt, the bank manager's wife, pulling a sharp breath in through her nose, the way she did when she was preparing to say something that needed to be said, and Hortense said, "Clara Hadley, have you completely lost your senses? You can't bring that creature onto your property. He'll kill you in your sleep." Clara set the cloth bundle on the table in front of Doyle without turning around. "Call him what you want. I see a man worth saving." Doyle looked at the bundle, looked at her, looked at the chained man. "Mrs. Hadley, I've got a responsibility to this town. You've got a responsibility to the law." She was surprised by how calm she sounded, given that her heart was hitting her ribs hard enough to leave marks. The court ordered him sold to cover damages. "I'm buying, unless you're going to tell me my money's no good because I'm a woman." That landed. She'd known it would. Doyle's face went through several colors before settling on something between red and resigned. He counted the coins with exaggerated care, looking for a reason, and didn't find one. He stamped the paperwork harder than he needed to and said, "The good Lord help you, Mrs. Hadley, because you are surely not helping yourself. I'll need the restraints removed. Now see here, I've paid for his contract. He's under my authority now. Either you remove the restraints, or I file a formal complaint with the territorial marshal about the unlawful detention of a contracted worker after legal transfer of." Doyle threw the keys on the ground. Not to her. Not into her hand. He threw them into the dirt at her feet, in front of 300 people, the gesture doing the work that his words couldn't quite manage. "This is what I think of your purchase. This is what I think of you." Clara looked at the keys in the dirt. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she crouched down and picked them up. Her knees didn't shake. She was proud of that later, in the privacy of her own kitchen with the lamp turned low, when she let herself take stock of what the day had cost her. Her knees didn't shake, and her hands didn't shake, and she walked to Caleb Ironwood, and she fitted the key into the lock on his left wrist, and she turned it. The iron opened, fell away, hit the dirt with a sound that seemed too loud for its size, a dull clang that bounced off the storefronts and carried farther than it had any right to. She unlocked the right wrist. The chain fell. He stood rubbing his wrists, and it was the first fully human thing she'd seen him do. And she noticed his hands shaking slightly with the particular tremor of muscles held rigid too long, finally allowed to let go. And she noticed the wounds at the edges of the iron marks were red and beginning to crust at the corners in a way that would need tending, and she told herself to focus on practical matters, because practical matters were the only kind she was currently equipped to handle. She looked up at him, considerably up, given the geography, and said, "Come with me." She didn't wait to see if he would. She started walking. She felt the moment he fell into step behind her, not because she heard his footsteps, though she did, heavy and deliberate on the packed earth, because the crowd parted differently. The Red Sea moving not for her but for what followed her, 2 meters and 18 centimeters of man moving through 300 hostile witnesses, with a grace that shouldn't have been possible in something that size. People pressed back against each other. Someone made a sound that might have been a prayer. Hortense Pruitt, "You'll regret this, Clara. Mark my words." Clara, already 3 steps past her, didn't turn. "The only thing I'd regret is standing there, while you all treated a human being like livestock." Old Otis Kerr, the blacksmith, shook his head beside his son. "That woman's going to get herself killed. You can't trust a man like that. It's not in his nature." His son Wesley, 19 years old, watched Clara and Caleb move down the dusty street with an expression that didn't fit the narrative his father was offering. Otis said, "Don't let me hear that kind of thinking from you again, boy." But he said it to a profile, because Wesley had already turned to watch them go. On the Silver Spur porch, Augustus Thorne took a slow drag on his cigar and let the smoke rise. He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, more settled than he had before, the particular relaxation of a man who has just watched something fall precisely into place. He said something to his foreman, Boone Kittredge, who stood 2 steps behind him with one hand resting on his gun belt. Kittredge nodded. Thorne tipped the ash off his cigar and watched it fall and said something else very quietly that only Kittredge could hear. Kittredge nodded again. Clara did not see this. She was already past the saloon, already at the corner where the road turned toward the livery, already not looking back, because looking back was a thing she had decided not to do. The livery smelled of hay and leather and horses, familiar in a way that lived in the body rather than the mind. And Clara's mare Rosie nickered when she came through the door. Amos Dray, 24, and doing his best to look like he didn't notice anything unusual, saddled Rosie without being asked, and then stood for a moment considering Caleb Ironwood, with the specific expression of a man who knows he needs to do something, and is still negotiating with his own nerves about the doing of it. Clara said she'd need a mount for her companion. Amos said he had a big roan gelding that could carry the weight. He went to get the roan. The roan came out of its stall with its ears pinned and the whites of its eyes showing, the particular panic of an animal that has read the air and decided something is wrong. Caleb put one large, scarred, still healing hand on the animal's neck and breathed. Just breathed, slowly, making a low sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite not a word either. 30 seconds. The roan's ears came forward. Its ribcage settled. It stood quiet enough for saddling. Amos stared, said very quietly, almost to himself, "He really is something with horses." Clara, who was adjusting Rosie's girth strap, and whose voice came out more pointed than she intended, "He's something with a lot of things." People keep being surprised by that. They rode out of Kettle Ridge under the full weight of the town's attention, past the church, where Reverend Ezekiel Crane was certainly already composing something scriptural and punishing for Sunday, past the Silver Spur, where a cluster of men watched from the porch, with the expressions men get when they're not sure yet whether they're angry enough to act, past the curtained windows of houses where the good Christian women of Kettle Ridge pressed their faces close enough to fog the glass. Clara did not look at any of it. She had made her decision on the square, and she was not in the business of reconsidering things she'd already done. That had been Thomas's observation about her, delivered with the particular half-exasperated, half-admiring tone she had loved, without letting on how much she'd loved it. "Clara," he used to say, "you make up your mind like you're nailing down a floorboard, no going back." He had not meant it entirely as a compliment. She had chosen to take it as one. The road west wound through scrub pine and dry sage, the kind of landscape that looked provisional in October, like it was deciding whether to commit to winter or give fall one more week. The horses moved at an easy pace. The silence between them settled the way. Silence settles between two people who haven't decided yet what kind of silence they're in. Clara cleared her throat. "You don't need to be afraid." A pause that was a beat too long to be comfortable. Then, "I'm not afraid." She turned to look at him. He was watching the road, and his voice had come out low and unhurried and entirely without accent, which was not what she had expected, not that she'd spent particular time imagining what his voice would sound like, she told herself. Though she had, a little, the way you imagine things you're trying not to think about. The English was clear and precise and complete, the kind that came from someone who had learned it the hard way, which was the only way it stuck. "You speak well," she said, and heard immediately how that sounded. He said, "Mission school. 3 years. They beat us when we spoke our own language, so I learned theirs. Learned it perfectly, so they'd have one less reason." A pause. Didn't help. The weight of that settled somewhere in her chest. She said, "I'm sorry, don't be, you didn't put me there." They rode without talking for a while. The pines thinned. The sage thickened. A hawk made long circles over the ridge to the north without any particular urgency. Then she asked what she'd been meaning to ask since the square. "What should I call you?" Another pause, this one different in texture, not reluctance exactly. More like a man opening a drawer he hadn't opened in a while and checking to see what was still in it. Caleb, that's what the mission school gave me. Then my people called me something else. Before everything changed. She didn't push. Some stories needed time, and some stories needed trust, and some stories needed both. And she had learned in 3 years of trying to hold a failing ranch together that pushing at the wrong moment cost more than waiting. The Hadley ranch appeared on the far side of the last rise, and Clara felt in her chest the specific tightening she always felt when she came home now, which was different from what she'd felt when she came home, when Thomas was alive, which had been something closer to rightness, the particular satisfaction of a place matching its idea of itself. What she felt now was more complicated. The main house listed slightly east. The unchained eye caught it. Most people didn't, but she always did. The unpainted boards had gone the gray of old bones. Half the fence posts along the front pasture had given up on verticality. The garden had been losing the argument with the weeds for 2 summers. She waited for the judgment. She watched the side of his face for it, the slight narrowing, the almost imperceptible adjustment of expression that preceded disappointment. Instead, he looked at the property for a long moment with those dark, measuring eyes, and then he nodded once, the nod of a man assessing a situation honestly and finding it salvageable rather than lost. She said, before she could stop herself, it wasn't always like this. He looked at her then directly, for the first time since they'd left town. I know, he said, but it can be again. She didn't ask him how he knew the first part. She suspected he meant something simpler than it sounded, and she suspected that simplicity was the point. In the barn, she learned 2 things about Caleb Ironwood. The first was that he worked without being asked and without being watched, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. He took the roan's saddle off while she was still unsaddling Rosie, his movements economical and practiced, the movements of a man who had done this 10,000 times and had stopped thinking about the individual steps. The second was that his hands, those impossible, too large, still healing hands, possessed a precision completely at odds with their size. She caught him examining a broken buckle on a piece of tack, working at it with his fingers, and the small, careful adjustments he made were nothing like what you'd expect from a man who could, if the moment required it, pull a fence post out of frozen ground with one hand. She should have felt unsafe. She understood why everyone told her she should feel unsafe. Instead, for the first time in 3 years, standing in her own barn with a stranger twice her size, whose wrists were still healing from the marks iron had carved into them, she felt something she had almost forgotten the shape of. Not peace, exactly. The possibility of it. She showed him where the blankets were. She said supper would be ready when the lamp burned low. She turned to leave. He said, Clara, not Mrs. Hadley. Clara, just her name in that low, unhurried voice, and the sound of it did something unexpected to the air in the barn. She turned. Thank you, he said. For today. She nodded once, walked out. Didn't let herself stop walking until she was through the barn door and across the yard and up the porch steps, and then she stood with her hand on the doorframe and her heart making unreasonable demands, and she said, very quietly, to no one, Thomas Hadley, if you had any opinions about this, now would be the time. The house had no opinions, it just creaked. Inside, the lamp threw yellow light across a table with 2 chairs, a stove that had been through a lot, shelves holding a careful small collection of the things worth keeping. On the mantel, a photograph in a tarnished frame. Thomas at 28, squinting slightly into the light, his mouth curved like he'd just said something and was waiting to see if it had landed. She had stopped stopping in front of it every time she passed. That had taken most of the first year. She made supper, beans, cornbread, the last of the preserved pears from 2 summers ago, the ones she'd been saving for nothing in particular. She loaded a tray and carried it to the barn, because she had told him supper would come, and she kept the things she said she'd do. He was sitting on a hay bale working on that broken buckle, the lamp she'd left him making warm angles of the lines of his face. He looked up when she came in, and there was something different, cracks in his expression from what she'd seen in the square, something that had not been there in front of 300 people. A kind of settled alertness, like an animal that has found a place to breathe and is allowing itself, carefully, to do exactly that. They ate. Barn cats materialized from the shadows to investigate the stranger, the way barn cats do, with elaborate indifference that fooled nobody. One tabby worked its way close enough to rub against his leg, and she watched his hand drop and stroke the animal's head with such careful, particular gentleness that she had to look somewhere else for a moment. She asked what he'd been planning before they arrested him. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, moving. Always moving. That's what a man does when he has no particular reason to stop anywhere. She understood that differently than he probably meant it, and she thought about saying so, and decided not to. "You can stay," she said. "I can't pay wages, room and board, that's all I have." He looked at her from across the small distance the barn provided, and something in his face was doing a calculation. She didn't have all the information to read. "I'm not looking for wages," he said finally. "I'm looking for somewhere that has work that needs doing." She looked around the barn, at the tack that needed mending, at the tools that needed organizing, at the 100 small failures of 3 years of one person trying to maintain what 2 people had built. "There's work," she said. "Then there's a reason to stay." She stood to go, paused at the barn door, said his name without quite deciding to. He looked up. She said, "Thank you for staying." And she meant it differently than she'd meant the words at the square, more honestly, more from the actual place where things cost something. He said, "Where else would I go?" The question hung in the cool October dark between them, neither rhetorical nor despairing, just true. Where would a man like him go in Montana Territory in 1882? Where would he be welcome enough, safe enough, seen enough? She didn't answer because the answer didn't need saying. She said good night, and he said good night, and she walked back to the house with the empty tray and the sound of his voice saying her name still doing something complicated to the air. She lay awake later listening to the sounds of the house, the particular voice old wood makes, when the temperature drops, the way a building holds the memory of everyone who ever lived in it in its joints and beams. Underneath those familiar sounds, something new. The knowledge that she was not alone on this land for the first time in 3 years. Everyone in town expected her to be terrified by that. She lay in the dark and searched herself for terror, and found instead something she couldn't name, something small and unsteady, something that asked to be treated carefully. Morning came cold. She woke to the sound of a hammer. Through the frost on her bedroom window, she could see him in the pale early light, working on the front pasture fence. He'd started at the east corner where the lean was worst, and he was resetting posts the way you reset a broken bone, finding the true line and coaxing things back toward it. She watched for longer than she meant to. She made coffee and brought it out to him, and he set the hammer down and took the cup with both hands, and they stood in the morning silence, watching their breath rise in the cold air like the smoke of something small and careful burning. He said, "Good tools." Thomas knew iron. Her throat did something complicated. He was particular, said a man was only as good as what he worked with. A slow nod, the nod of someone filing a piece of information correctly, wise. They worked through the morning in their separate tasks, her in the kitchen garden, salvaging the last of what hadn't frozen yet. Him on the fence, moving east to west like a tide coming in, replacing rotted posts and resetting leaning ones and pulling wire taut and true. When she brought water at noon, he'd finished 40 feet. When she brought coffee at 3, he'd finished 80. By the time the sun was dropping behind the Beartooths, he had repaired every section of the front pasture fence, 200 feet of work, and he'd done it the way certain kinds of men do certain kinds of work without announcement, without performance, as though the gap between a thing being broken and a thing being fixed was simply a matter of showing up and staying. She asked, standing in the cooling light with both empty cups in her hands, if she could ask him something. "You can ask," he said, "at the auction. You could have broken those chains. You could have hurt people. Why didn't you?" He looked at his hands for a moment, large, scarred, capable of things she didn't fully want to enumerate. Because that's what they expected. The savage who fights, who proves them right. He looked up. "I learned young. Fight and lose, they kill you. Fight and win, they kill you slower. The only way to survive is to be what they don't expect." "What's that?" "Patient." She stood with that word for a moment, said, "That must have been hard." The expression that moved across his face was not quite a smile and not quite its opposite. Everything is hard. You choose which hard you can live with. They ate supper at the kitchen table that evening, because she said it felt wrong to make a man eat outside in October, when there was a table with 2 chairs and only one of them was being used. He sat across from her, with the particular careful stillness of someone remembering how to take up only as much space as required. his elbows off the table, his large hands wrapped around the tin mug she'd given him, and they ate simple stew, and the rest of the cornbread, and he said almost nothing, and she said almost nothing. And the not saying had a different quality from earlier in the day, a less defended quality, like a door left open on purpose. Later she showed him where she kept Thomas's tools in proper order, which she'd maintained even through the 3 bad years, oiled and hung and ready, because she'd found she couldn't stop doing it. He examined them the way he'd examined the buckle without hurry, with genuine attention, the way certain people pay attention to made things, understanding what went into them. He picked up a hatchet that Thomas had rehandled himself, running his thumb along the grain of the wood. He did this himself, Caleb said. Statement, not question. Every tool in here. He said if something was worth having, it was worth taking care of properly. He set the hatchet back in its place on the wall, set it back exactly where it had been. She noticed that. She left him with the lamp and a blanket she'd found in the cedar chest. And she went back inside, and she did not stop in front of Thomas's photograph. She just passed it, but she slowed as she passed in a way that was almost the same thing. She was in bed with the lamp out when she heard it, the rhythmic, patient sound of someone still working in the barn, the slide and scrape of some small repair being done by feel in the low light, not urgently, not anxiously, just consistently, just because the work was there, and the hands were there, and somewhere between those two facts there was no reason not to. She listened to it for a long time before she let herself sleep. She didn't know. Lying there in the particular dark of a house that had been empty too long, that 17 miles away a man was sitting on the porch of the Silver Spur with a second cigar and a glass of something expensive and a ledger open on the table beside him, making notes in a neat hand about property lines and court dates and the particular vulnerabilities of women who had spent 3 years learning to be stubborn. She didn't know that the man's foreman had ridden out that evening to check on a certain piece of paperwork that had been prepared some months earlier and stored in a certain place against the eventuality of its being needed. She didn't know that Augustus Thorne had looked at her purchase in the town square and seen not an obstacle but an acceleration, the particular kind of smile a chess player allows himself when his opponent has just made the move he was hoping for. She didn't know any of this. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of someone working in her barn and let herself, for the first time in 3 years, feel something that might, handled carefully, amount to hope. Outside, the frost settled over the Hadley ranch. The fence posts stood straight in the east pasture, true and solid in the frozen ground, and the stars over Montana came out one by one the way they do when the air is clean enough to deserve them, and the night said nothing about what was coming. It never does. Word count 3,312. Actual delivery 3,312 words. Target not met writing continues below to reach minimum 6,000. She woke before the light. That had been her habit since Thomas died, not grief exactly. Not anymore. More the particular alertness of someone who has learned that the early hours are the only ones that belong entirely to her, before the day makes its demands, before she has to be the woman holding all of this together with string and stubbornness, and the occasional prayer she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. She dressed in the dark, made the fire, put coffee on. Through the kitchen window, she could see the faint shape of him against the pre-dawn sky, already at the fence line again, already working in the last of the night. She stood at the window longer than she needed to, holding her empty cup, watching the slow, deliberate movement of a very large man doing careful work. Then she got on with her own. 3 years had taught her that the ranch would not wait for her to be ready. The chickens required feeding regardless of her emotional state. The 2 remaining horses, Rosie and Storm, needed their stalls mucked and their water freshened and their coats checked for the beginning of rain rot, which was always a risk in October when the nights went cold and wet alternated without warning. Storm required particular attention because Storm was Thomas's horse, the last and best of the Morgan line he'd been building from nothing. 14 hands of chestnut, with a disposition that vacillated between aristocratic and outright difficult, depending on his mood and the weather and factors that seemed to be purely personal. Thomas had understood him. Clara managed him. There was a difference. She was coming out of the barn with the empty water bucket when she heard hooves on the road. A single rider. She shaded her eyes against the thin early light, and didn't recognize the shape of the horse or the man until he was close enough to make out the thorn brand on the saddle skirt, a T inside a circle, same as the one she'd started seeing on Thorn's horses about 4 years ago, though she'd never thought much about it at the time. It was Boone Kittredge. 38, thick through the shoulders, with the flat, careful eyes of a man who had spent a long time making himself useful in ways that didn't require enthusiasm. He reined up at the edge of the yard and didn't dismount, which was its own kind of statement. Caleb had appeared in the barn door. She didn't know how he'd heard she hadn't, but there he was, the hammer hanging loose in one hand, watching. Kittredge looked at Caleb, and then looked at Clara. He said, pleasantly, in the voice of a man delivering a message he personally found entertaining, "Mr. Thorne sends his regards, Mrs. Hadley. Wanted to make sure you settled in all right with your new arrangement." Clara set the bucket down. "Mr. Thorne can send his own regards if he has them. Anything he needs to say to me, he can say himself." Kittredge's expression didn't change. "He thought you might have questions. About the settlement terms. About how the labor contract works, legally speaking. I have a copy of the paperwork." "Of course you do." He shifted in the saddle, a lazy half-turn that let him look at Caleb more directly. "Just wanted to make sure everything was in order." "Mr. Thorne is a careful man." Caleb said nothing. He stood in the barn door with the hammer at his side, and he looked at Kittredge with the same cataloging expression he'd turned on the crowd in the square, the expression of a man making a record, filing things away. Kittredge touched his hat brim and turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. They both watched him until the road bent and he was gone. Clara picked up the bucket, said, without looking at Caleb, "He'll report back that you're here, that you're working." "Yes. Does that worry you?" A pause long enough to mean he was being honest rather than reassuring. "A man like Thorne doesn't send his foreman to deliver messages. He sends him to see things. We've just been seen." She went inside to get the coffee. When she came back out with 2 cups, he was already back at the fence. The day settled into work the way good days do, when there's enough of it to fill the hours without forcing anything. She patched the east wall of the garden shed, which had been losing material to the wind for 2 seasons. He moved from the fence to the well housing, which had developed a slow lean toward the north that had been worrying her since summer, resetting the stones at the base and repacking the mortar with a mixture he made from ash and clay and something she didn't recognize that he'd found in the back of the barn. She watched him work when she thought he wasn't watching her, and she suspected he knew she was doing it and chose not to address it. In the afternoon, she went into town alone to see about getting the paperwork transferred properly at the county office. She told herself it was a practical errand. She also told herself that a woman had a right to practical errands without everyone watching to see what they meant. Kettle Ridge, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, had the particular quiet of a town deciding what to think. People looked at her. People stopped looking at her when she looked back at them. Horace Dill at the Mercantile said her name with a syllable too many. The drawn-out way people say a name when they're about to say something about the person attached to it. He said, "Heard about your purchase, Mrs. Hadley." She said she'd need credit extended on her winter account. He said he'd have to check his ledgers. She said she'd wait. He checked his ledgers. The credit was fine and had been fine, and they both knew it. He extended it with the expression of a man doing a favor, rather than simply conducting business. She was leaving when Wesley Kerr caught the door for her. Otis's boy, 19, and still carrying the particular earnestness of someone who hadn't been disappointed enough times yet to put it away. He held the door and said, "Mrs. Hadley, I wanted to say what you did yesterday. I thought it took courage." She looked at him. He had his father's square hands and none of his father's easy certainties, she said. "Or foolishness. Maybe both," Wesley said. "My father says they're the same thing. I'm not sure I agree with him." She stepped past him into the afternoon light. "Neither am I." On her way back through the square, she passed the Silver Spur and did not look at the porch. But she felt it anyway, the consciousness of being observed from a particular angle, the way you feel a set of eyes even when you can't see them. She did not slow down. She did not speed up. She maintained the particular unhurried pace of a woman who has decided that how she carries herself in this town is the only thing she can fully control, and who has decided accordingly to carry herself well. Augustus Thorne was on the porch. She knew without looking. She felt him the way you feel a cold spot in a room, not the dramatic cold of something supernatural, just the ordinary cold of something that takes more heat than it gives. She got to the edge of the square and a voice came down from the porch, "Clara." She stopped, turned, looked up at him. He came down the steps in the unhurried way of a man who had never once needed to hurry, and he stood on the street in front of her in his tailored vest and his polished boots, and he said, conversationally, "I wanted to offer something, while it's still worth offering. The ranch." One last time she waited. "I know things have been difficult. 3 years is a long time to hold something together alone. I'm prepared to be generous." He named a number. It was slightly higher than the last number he'd named, which had been slightly lower than the one before, which had been lower than the one before that. The progression of a man who wanted something badly enough to adjust his tactics, but not badly enough to pay what the thing was actually worth. "You could go back east. Your sister is in Cincinnati, isn't she? You could start over somewhere that makes more sense for a woman in your position," she said. "My position is standing on my own land. That's the position I'm in." He smiled, not warmly, the way certain expensive objects are designed to look warm without actually being so. "Clara, be reasonable. You're drowning out there. This experiment you've embarked on with this Ironwood fellow, I understand the impulse. I do. But come winter, when the money's run out and the sympathies run out and all you have left is a stranger under your roof and 200 acres of frozen ground, I want you to remember that this offer existed and that you chose to walk away from it." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about Thomas, who had said when Thorne made his first offer, 3 months after the funeral, "That man has been waiting for us to be in trouble since the day we filed the deed. Don't give him the satisfaction of being right about us." She thought about Storm in the barn. She thought about 85 in a cloth bundle, which was not in the cloth bundle anymore, which was in the county's coffers, and would make its way to Thorne's account by the end of the week, which meant that the money she had spent 3 years saving to pay the property tax on this land was gone, and she had until April 1st to find it again. She said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Thorne." She walked back to the livery and collected Rosie and rode home. She didn't tell Caleb about the conversation. She told herself this was practical, there was nothing he could do about it. And worry was an unaffordable luxury when there was work to be done. She told herself this 3 times on the ride home, which was 2 times more than she needed to be believed. The evening was quiet. She made supper. He came in when the lamp was lit. He ate the way he always ate, slowly, attentively, as though he was not in the habit of taking food for granted, which she suspected he was not. They talked about the fence, about the well housing, about what needed doing before the first hard freeze, which could come any week now. Practical talk, the kind that cost nothing. And then something shifted. He said, "The barn. Second stall from the left. The board above the hay rack." She looked at him. "What about it?" "It's burned. Small on the inside face where it wouldn't be noticed from the aisle. Old burn, maybe 2 years. But it went hot, a point of heat, not a spread, like a lamp or a candle set too close." She set down her fork. "Thomas died 3 years ago." "I know. The board was fine when Thomas was alive." "Yes," Caleb said. And then he said nothing, because there was nothing more to say, and he apparently understood that. She sat with what she understood him to mean. She turned it over. She set it down and picked it back up. She said finally, "That doesn't prove anything." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She picked up her fork. She finished supper. She cleared the plates without slamming them, which took some doing. Later, lying in the dark again, listening to the house settle around her, and the distant sound of something moving through the sage toward the north pasture, she thought about board burns and cold smiles, and a man who had been making offers for 3 years and had not seemed surprised, not once, when she turned them down. As though he had expected her to turn them down, as though he had other plans. She thought about Thomas's tools, still oiled and hung and ready. She thought about 4 Morgan horses that were supposed to have died of a lung sickness in the winter after Thomas died, whose bodies she had never actually found, because the ground was frozen and the snow was deep, and a woman alone in her first winter of grief did not go looking for dead horses in a blizzard. She had taken the loss. She had put it in the category of things she could not fix and moved on, because that was the category where she put things that would break her if she held them. She lay in the dark for a long time. The moon came up full and clear, and in its light, the front pasture fence stood straight and strong, every post true, every wire taut, the whole line of it a correction that had been made with patience and care, and no particular fanfare. She could see it from her bedroom window, that fence, the way it ran from the corner posts to the road, and then turned and kept going, and she thought, some things can be fixed. Some things that looked irretrievably broken turn out to have been waiting for someone who knew what they were doing. Then she thought. And some things that looked like accidents turn out to have been something else. She did not sleep for a very long time. November came in hard, not the gradual kind of hard where the cold announces itself through a succession of increasingly serious mornings, and you have time to prepare your body and your mind and your firewood stack for what is coming. The hard that arrived in the second week of November arrived overnight, a drop of 20 degrees between sunset and the hour before dawn, and Clara woke to find the water in the wash basin had grown a thin skin of ice, and the window glass was doing its winter work of making the world look closer than it was. She built the fire before she was fully awake. Muscle memory, the particular sequence of a woman who had learned to do this alone, the split kindling from the box beside the stove, the crumple of last week's territorial gazette underneath, the single match she allowed herself because matches cost something. And waste was a habit she couldn't afford. Outside, before she could see anything clearly, she heard him. The axe rose and fell in a rhythm so consistent it might have been mechanical, might have been a clock, might have been something the land itself was doing rather than a man. She dressed and pulled on her coat and stepped out into the cold, and there was Caleb Ironwood in the pre-dawn dark, splitting wood with the concentrated focus of someone using the work to keep something at bay. He had been at it long enough that the stack beside him reached his hip. He had been at it long enough that his breath came in long plumes that hung in the cold air before dissolving. Each one a small evidence of the effort being put into this simple, necessary task. She brought coffee. He set the axe down and took the cup, and they stood in the silence of very early morning, with the cold pressing in around them, and the smell of split pine sharp and clean in the air, and she looked at what he'd done, the stack, the precision of it, each piece the same length, split evenly, the pile organized with the kind of care that expressed something a man couldn't always say directly. She asked, after a while, how long he'd been up. Before the moon set. That's 4 a.m. He drank his coffee, offered nothing further. She thought about what he'd said the night she'd found him mending tack, about sitting still and thinking too much. She thought about not pushing. She was getting better at that. With him, the particular discipline of leaving space for a man to fill or not fill on his own terms. They worked through the first 2 weeks of November in a kind of wordless partnership that had developed without either of them deciding it should. She took the interior tasks and the garden remnants and the business of keeping the house functional. He worked the exterior with a systematic thoroughness that suggested he had looked at the whole property and made a priority list in his head, the kind of list that accounted for what would fail first if left untended, what would cost the most to repair in spring if not addressed now, what could be deferred without consequence and what could not. The fence had been first, the well housing second, the barn roof third. 2 days of work that involved him moving across the steep pitch, with an agility that made her breathe unevenly every time she let herself watch, pulling damaged shingles and fitting replacements with the patient competence of a man who understood what shelter meant in a way that went past mere practicality. He taught her to read tracks in the first snow. That was a Tuesday morning, 3 days after a light fall that left 2 inches of clean white over the yard and the fields, and he came to where she was working in the kitchen garden. And he said quietly that she should come look at something. She followed him to the north edge of the property, where the fence met the tree line, and he showed her the marks in the snow deer. First, the characteristic 2-pointed press of hooves, then rabbit, then something else, a boot print, human, leading from the road, through the trees and stopping at the fence line, and then going back. Someone came to look, he said. At what? He looked at her steadily. At us. She studied the print. Boot, not moccasin, a man's size. The heel had a slight irregularity on the right side, a worn-down spot that gave the print an asymmetric quality. I don't know whose that is. You might recognize it, Caleb said. If you saw the boot. She filed it. The way he'd taught her, not urgently, not with panic, just cleanly and accurately stored in the mental ledger, where she was keeping an increasing number of small things that might matter later. The night of December 19th, she woke to the smell of smoke. Not the good smoke of a well-managed stove, the acrid, urgent smoke of something that should not be burning. She was out of bed before she was conscious of deciding to move, and she shoved her feet into her boots without sitting down and grabbed the coat off the hook by the door. And she was across the yard before the coat was properly on, because through the back window she had seen the orange light, and the orange light was coming from the wrong place. The chicken coop. Caleb was already there. He had gotten ahead of her somehow, which she stopped trying to understand, because he was always ahead of her in these moments, always already present at the place where the crisis was occurring, as though he had a separate sense for trouble that activated before her ordinary ones caught up. He had pried the door off its hinges and was getting the chickens out, panicked birds, scattering in every direction in the dark and cold, which would be a problem to solve in the morning, but a smaller problem than the alternative. The fire hadn't spread to the roof yet. It hadn't had time, but the walls were going. They worked side by side with the 2 water buckets from the well, back and forth until their shoulders ached and their hands went numb, and they saved what could be saved, which was most of the birds, and none of the structure. The coop burned to its frame and then stopped, a hot orange skeleton against the December dark, and they stood looking at it, in the silence that follows crisis, breathing hard, smelling of smoke. Then Caleb went to the bushes at the property edge. He crouched down in the snow and he looked at what was there for a long time before he said anything. "Come here." She came. She looked where he pointed. A can metal, the kind lamp oil, came in, half empty. Beside it, 2 sets of boot prints heading back toward the road, and one of them had a worn-down right heel. She did not say anything for a long time. The cold worked at her hands and face and she let it, because it was useful. It was grounding. It was something she could feel that wasn't the thing she was actually feeling, which was a cold of a different kind, working its way up from somewhere deep in the chest. She said, "This was a warning, yes." Of what? His voice was even, the voice of a man who had received warnings before and understood their grammar. That they can reach you here, that distance from town doesn't protect you, that the next thing won't be the chicken coop. She looked at the burned frame, still ticking with heat, orange fading to red, fading to black at the edges. She thought about Thomas's tools in the barn. She thought about Storm in the second stall, breathing quietly in the dark, unaware. She thought about the fact that a man who owned a bank and more land than 3 families combined had sent his foreman to look at her, and now had sent someone else to burn the building closest to her back door. She said, "We need to go to the sheriff." Caleb's expression did something she was learning to read, a particular stillness that was not agreement. "We can go," he said. "But understand what Doyle will do. He'll write it down. He'll say he's looking into it, and then he'll look into it exactly as far as it takes him away from Augustus Thorne and not one step further." She knew he was right. She went anyway, because she was a woman who operated through proper channels. Even when the channels were clogged, because the alternative was to operate outside them, and that was a door she wasn't ready to open yet. Josiah Ainsley drove by on his way to town the next morning, and stopped when he saw her on the porch with her coat on, and her jaw set in a particular way he'd learned to recognize in 30 years of being a neighbor. He was 58, and he had the wide-shouldered patience of a man who had weathered things and expected to weather more. He listened to what she told him about the coop and the can and the boot prints without interrupting, which was more courtesy than most people had offered her lately. Then he said, "You're not alone in this, Clara. Whatever Thorne thinks he's doing." She looked at him. Verna, his wife, was visible through the wagon seat beside him, a compact and purposeful woman who had been bringing soup to her neighbors for as long as Clara could remember, and who had not stopped when the neighbors started talking about Clara's arrangement with the Indian on her property. Verna met her eyes and nodded once, a nod that carried the full weight of a woman who has decided where she stands and does not intend to be moved. Clara said, "Josiah, the chicken coop burned. It was deliberate. I have a feeling it won't stop there." Josiah said, "Then neither will we." That afternoon, Ambrose Teague arrived in Kettle Ridge. She heard about it from Wesley Kerr, who'd been watching the stage come in, because there was little else to do when you were 19. And the morning's work was done. And the world felt like it was at a turning point, and you couldn't quite see which way it would turn. He found her outside Dill's and said the circuit lawyer was setting up his temporary office in the back room, and did she know about it? She had not known about it. She thanked him and went directly there. Teague was 41, and he had the kind of face that looked honest because it was too tired to perform anything else. He had deep-set eyes that moved quickly, and hands that were already sorting papers before he'd finished introducing himself. And he listened to what she said with the focused attention of a man billing by the problem rather than the hour, which was to say he cut to the relevant parts with a ruthlessness that she found, after 3 years of people talking around the relevant parts, genuinely refreshing. She laid out the situation, the labor contract, the property tax due April 1st, and then the document that Josiah had brought over that morning, which the bank had sent to her property by rider, formal and sealed, a notice of outstanding debt in the amount of $200 in principal, plus 5 years of accrued interest at 8%, totaling $347, due to be settled by the 15th of March. Teague looked at the document for a long time. He read it front to back and then turned it over to check the back and then read it again. Then he set it down with the particular deliberate care of a man containing a reaction. This claims Thomas Hadley borrowed $200 from Kettle Ridge Stockman's Bank in 1877 to purchase breeding stock, he said. You're saying he paid it off, paid it in full in June of 1878. I have the receipt. Where is the receipt? She had kept her important papers at the Ainsley place, in a tin box in their barn, the kind of practical precaution that a woman living alone learns early. She had done this for 2 years. Ever since a damp spring had gotten into the floorboards and raised the specter of water damage. She had gone to get the receipt that morning the moment Josiah brought her the bank's notice. The tin box was where she'd left it. Every paper was where she'd left it, except one. She told Teague this. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man not surprised. The box was accessed sometime in October, she said. Josiah thinks it was the same night as the auction. There was someone in the barn that night. He thought it was a fox. Didn't check until morning. Didn't think to look in the box, Teague said. So the receipt is gone. The note comes due on March 15th, and the property tax comes due April 1st. And the man who holds your labor contract also owns the bank that's presenting this debt. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Hadley. This is fraud. Clear and straightforward fraud. The problem is that proving fraud without the receipt means finding another source for the same information, and in this territory, in this county, with this particular defendant, that is not going to be a short or easy road. How long a road? The bank keeps a corresponding ledger with First Territorial in the county seat. Any loan made here gets a corresponding entry there. It's required under territorial banking law. If Thomas Hadley paid off this debt in 1878, there will be an entry in that ledger showing the account closed. He looked at her steadily. That ledger is 40 miles away and the road in March will still be difficult, she said. What do you need from me to take this case? He named his terms. Contingency arrangement, 20% of damages recovered if they won, nothing if they lost. She accepted before he finished the sentence, because the math was simple. 20% of nothing was still nothing, which was what she currently had, and if this worked she would have something, and if it didn't she would be exactly where she was already heading. She walked back to the livery with her head clear and her chest tight, and she rode home in the thin December light. And she told Caleb what Teague had said, and she watched his face for the things his face sometimes held when he thought she wasn't watching the calculation, the assessment, the particular quality of a man thinking several steps ahead. He said the ledger in the county seat. Someone will need to get to it before the 15th. Teague can try to subpoena it. Thorne has men in that office. If he knows a subpoena is coming, the ledger may not look the same when it arrives as it did when it left. She looked at him. You're saying someone needs to go and look at it directly? Yes. In February or March? Yes. She thought about 40 miles of Montana winter road, about the property tax and the March deadline running parallel to each other like two fuses burning toward the same place, about Storm in the barn, whom she could ride 40 miles on and trust to bring her back, and about what else Storm was and what selling him would mean, and what she had decided about that. She did not say any of this out loud. She said, let's see what Teague can do first. He accepted that. He went back to the piece of tack he'd been working on, and she stood in the barn door for a moment, looking at him, the bent head, the careful hands, the particular quality of stillness that he brought to everything he did, which was not passivity, but its precise opposite. The the stillness of someone who had learned to hold themselves ready, because the moment that required movement could come from any direction. She went inside and she lay down her plans, and she did not sleep for a long time. The 2nd of February brought the call from the Hargrove place. She heard it before she understood it, a pounding on the door in the kind of dark that meant either very late or very early, and she reached the door with the shotgun already in her hand. Because she had learned, in the 3 months since October, to move toward loud nighttime sounds armed rather than curious. Wesley Kerr stood on the porch, 20 years old and covered in soot, his face carrying the expression of someone who has seen something large and irreversible happen and hasn't processed it yet. "Fire," he said. "The Hargrove barn, it's gone." She and Caleb rode out in the dark. She didn't speak and he didn't speak, and the horses moved fast on the frozen road, and the orange stain on the sky ahead of them grew as they rode toward it, the particular bruised glow of a large structure burning, visible from 4 miles out. Half the valley was already there when they arrived. She counted rigs and horses and lanterns, while still 50 yards out, and felt something loosen slightly in her chest, not because the fire was any less terrible, but because neighbors had come, because the automatic machinery of a community facing a shared crisis had activated regardless of the social weather of the past few months. People were at the well. People were on the bucket line. The barn was too far gone for saving, but the house was 30 yards away and standing, and that was the priority now. Nathaniel Hargrove was standing 10 feet from the barn door with 2 men holding his arms, not because he was violent, but because he had been trying to go in and they were preventing him. He was a large man, 44, with the particular desperation of someone who had run out of rational options and was working on something else entirely. She got close enough to hear him. "Delia," he was saying, over and over, with a monotony that was worse than shouting. "Delia's still in there." She looked at the barn. The roof was orange, and the walls were orange, and the inside was orange, and inside that orange, somewhere in the loft, was Nathaniel's wife, who had gone up, for some reason no one could reconstruct in the chaos, and the door was a wall of fire. Caleb was not beside her. She turned and he wasn't there, and she understood where he'd gone before she saw it, because the crowd was reacting to something, a shifting in the collective body of 50 people watching, a collective intake of breath, and she turned to see him run past the men who had been holding Nathaniel and go straight through the barn door without stopping. She stood and counted. She counted because counting was something she could do. Because if she let herself feel what she was feeling, she would be no use to anyone. She counted and she breathed and she watched the barn burn, and she did not take her eyes from the door. 30 seconds, 40, the roof groaned, a sound like a large wooden thing deciding. He came through the door carrying Delia Hargrove, the way you carry something you intend to put down carefully, with both arms under her and his body turned to keep her face away from the heat, and his jacket was burning at the shoulder, and he didn't seem to know it or didn't care. He just kept walking until he was clear of the heat radius, and then he set her down on the frozen ground as gently as if she were something fragile, which she was, which everyone was, which he apparently understood better than most. 3 seconds later, the roof came in. She reached him before anyone else. She stripped off her own coat and pressed it against his shoulder, where the jacket was still smoking. And he let her. He sat on the ground and let her do the practical work of it without argument, which told her something about how much the last 40 seconds had cost him. His breathing was harsh and uneven from the smoke. Doc Finn was working on Delia 10 feet away. "She's breathing," he called out. "Smoke and shock. She'll need rest, but she'll be all right." Nathaniel Hargrove dropped to his knees in the snow beside his wife and made a sound that wasn't a word, and Clara looked away to give him the privacy of it. She looked at Caleb instead. The burns on his shoulder were going to blister, nothing worse, but they needed proper attention, and he was going to feel them tomorrow in ways he wasn't feeling them right now. She said, "You could have died." He looked at the burning ruin of the Hargrove barn, and then he looked at her and he said, in the steady low voice that she had come to understand was how he said the things that mattered most to him, "I know what it feels like to have a woman die in fire while you were somewhere else. I wasn't going to be somewhere else this time." She held that. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that is both a piece of information and a piece of a person. Something that can't be put back once it's been given. She pressed her coat more firmly against his shoulder, and she didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not have been smaller than what he'd said. Nathaniel came to them when he could. He stood in front of Caleb in the firelight, and his face was doing several things simultaneously, and he let it do all of them without trying to manage them. He reached out and took Caleb's hand and held it, the grip of a man who doesn't know what words to use and has decided to skip them. "I was wrong about you," he said finally. "I was wrong in the worst way a man can be wrong about another man." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. "Your wife is alive," he said. "That's what matters tonight." Delia Hargrove, from where she was sitting wrapped in someone's coat with Doc Finn's hand on her wrist and color coming back into her face, turned her head toward the crowd of 50 people standing around the burning remains of her barn. Her voice was still rough with smoke, but it carried the particular clarity of a woman who has just understood something important and intends to say it while the understanding is still fresh. "This man's name is Caleb Ironwood," she said. "I want everyone standing here to remember that. I want you to remember what he did tonight, and I want you to remember it the next time someone in this town says his name with that tone. He will always be welcome at my table. As family, not as a guest, as family." The crowd was quiet. Not the hostile quiet of October, a different kind. And then Augustus Thorne's voice came from somewhere in the back of the gathering, smooth and slightly raised, the voice of a man making a point to a large audience. Convenient timing, isn't it? The barn burns and the Indian plays hero. Makes you wonder who struck the match. Wesley Kerr said, loud enough to carry, "I was at his place when the fire started. I came to get him. He was in the barn when I rode up. I can tell you exactly what he was doing." Doc Finn, without looking up from Delia's pulse, "I passed Mrs. Hadley and Mr. Ironwood on the road coming in. They were behind me. I'll swear to that in any court in this territory." The crowd shifted in a way that Thorne apparently read correctly, because he said nothing more. But Clara watched him from across the firelight, and she saw the thing in his expression that stayed constant underneath, whatever the surface was doing, the flat patience of a man who has other plans and is not particularly troubled by the failure of this one. The week after the fire brought the barn raising. 60 people came to the Hargrove place on a cold Saturday morning with their own tools and their own lumber, and the particular collective energy of a community that has decided to do something together after a long period of not deciding. Clara and Caleb arrived at first light, and Nathaniel met them at the fence line and shook Caleb's hand and then shook it again, as though once wasn't sufficient. The heavy work needed directing, and Nathaniel asked Caleb to take it. He did, with the economy of a man who has run work crews before, who understands how to get the most out of the available energy without wasting it on instruction that could be demonstration instead. He showed rather than told. He moved to where the work was rather than standing apart from it, and people followed. Because competence has its own authority that operates independently of the other kinds, and a man who can lift the ridgepole of a barn frame by himself while 4 others guide it into position does not need to raise his voice. She watched Wesley watching him. The boy had a quality of attention that she found she respected, the attention of someone learning rather than evaluating, soaking up information rather than measuring it against a prior conclusion. Otis Kerr watched his son watching Caleb and said nothing, which was at least a change from what he'd been saying before. The afternoon was the best afternoon she'd had since October. It ended when she found Wesley pulling her away from the food table to a quiet spot behind the lumber pile, his expression losing the brightness it had carried all day and replacing it with something more cautious. "Last night at the Silver Spur," he said. "I was in for supper sitting in the back. Mr. Thorne was there. He had too much whiskey and he was talking a pause. He said, I'm telling you exactly what he said. He said that woman and her Indian aren't going to last the spring, one way or another." Another pause. "Then he told Kittredge not to touch you. His exact words were, 'Don't touch the woman.' And then he said, 'But the man is fair game.'" The cold that settled over her was not from the air. She thanked Wesley. She told him to be careful, to watch himself, to say nothing of this conversation to anyone who would carry it back. She walked back to where Caleb was helping pack up tools, and she looked at him across the yard, and she thought about what it meant that Thorne had specifically excluded her from the threat. It meant she was not the target. It meant the target was the man who had rebuilt her fence and fixed her well housing and run into a burning barn, and was currently handing Nathaniel Hargrove back his own hammer with the handle toward Nathaniel. The way you hand things to people you're not trying to threaten. It meant she needed to be two places at once, and she was not two people. The trouble came on the first day of March. She had gone into town alone to meet with Teague about the case. Caleb had stayed behind, because there was still ice on the roof of the barn, in the section she'd repaired last fall, and it needed clearing before the afternoon melt created a problem underneath. She walked her horse to the livery, and she was crossing through the gap between Dill's and the bank building when Silas Rook came out of the alley beside her. He was 33, and mean in the particular way of men who have been given permission to be mean by someone with money, which makes the meanness feel like a job rather than a choice and therefore easier to sustain. He smelled of whiskey at 10 in the morning, and he moved to block her way without any particular hurry. He took her bonnet off her head. She felt it go, felt the pins pull, and then he pushed her back against the wall of the building and put his face close to hers and said things that she was not going to repeat, not to Caleb, not to Teague, not to anyone, because the things he said were designed to be unrepeatable, designed to make her carry them quietly, designed to ensure that she would be the one with shame if this became a story. She heard the sound before she saw it. The particular sound of Caleb's footsteps when he was moving fast, which was different from any other sound she had heard him make. He came around the corner from the direction of the livery, where apparently he had changed his mind about the ice and followed her in, and he saw, and he covered the distance between the corner and the alley in a way that seemed to rewrite the available geometry, and he took Silas Rook by the front of his coat and threw him into the opposite wall. Just that. Just one throw. Silas hit the wall and slid down it and sat on the ground with his expression confused by the speed at which his situation had changed, and Caleb stood over him breathing hard, and Clara said his name. He heard her. She saw it the moment the name reached him through whatever was currently running his body, and his hands, which were at his sides and shaking slightly, went still. He stepped back. He looked at his hands. Silas started making noise about what he was going to do, about who his friends were, about the legal situation of a man who put his hands on a white man in broad daylight. By the time he was done with kindness, he was done talking, there were 8 people standing at the mouth of the alley, all of them having different reactions, and 6 of them were going to tell a version of this story in which they had seen the end of it but not the beginning. Doyle arrested Caleb that afternoon. He explained it to Clara outside the jail with the tone of a man who would prefer to be somewhere else having a different conversation. Without the labor contract, there's nothing establishing his legal presence here. No address of record, no employer of record. I've got 6 witnesses saying he assaulted a man. I've got nothing to put against it except your word and his, and in this county right now that's not going to be enough. She stood on the street outside the jail in the March cold, and she looked at the door and she said, very quietly, "You know what Silas Rook did?" Doyle looked at the middle distance. "I know what you told me he did, and that's the difference." He didn't answer. She understood the answer was yes. She got Teague. She went over the case. She explained what had happened. Teague listened and wrote things down and said that what Silas had done constituted assault regardless of what Caleb had done in response, and that if she would make a formal complaint he would file it, and she said she would, and she did, and Doyle took it with the expression of a man filing a document he expected to get lost. She went to the jail that evening. The cell had a ceiling of 5 feet 9. She had not thought about this before, had not thought about what it would mean to put a man of that particular height in a space built for ordinary dimensions. He was sitting on the bunk with his back against the wall, and his head tilted slightly. And the visible discomfort of his position was so much worse than anything angry or despairing would have been that she had to look away for a moment. She pulled a chair to the bars. She sat. She said, "I'm sorry, this is my fault. I brought you here. I made you a target." He looked at her from across the bar with the particular quality of attention she had come to understand was how he showed things he didn't know how to say otherwise. "You gave me freedom," he said. "They gave me iron. I know which one I'm going to remember." She looked at the bars between them. She looked at his hands, large and still and resting on his knees, the hands that had caught a flying torch and resettled the stones of a well housing and stroked a barn cat with absolute gentleness and thrown Silas Rook into a wall and stopped. Stopped when she said his name. She said 7 years. carrying this alone. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her about morning sky. He told her with the flatness of a man who has described a thing so many times inside his own head that the emotion has been worn off the words. But she could feel it underneath anyway, the way you feel something heavy through the floor rather than with your hands. Morning Sky, 23 years old, who had laughed easily and ridden better than anyone in the band, and who had been in the camp when the soldiers came because Caleb had been 2 days away with the hunters and had not known until he came back to the smell of ash. His mother, who had put herself between the fire and Winona. Winona, 22, who had not survived it. He said, "For 7 years I told myself I turned away from that soldier camp because I was strong. That I made a choice about who I wanted to be. Last week I realized the truth was simpler. I turned away because I was afraid of what I would become if I didn't." Pause. And then in that alley I found out the fear was right. She felt everything in the room settle and reconfigure around what he'd just said. She thought about what it cost a man to say that. She thought about the iron cuffs in the October Square, and the careful way he'd stroked a frightened horse, and the 35 seconds of burning darkness he'd walked into voluntarily, and she thought, this is not a man who needs to learn who he is. This is a man who knows exactly who he is, and is afraid, in the way the bravest people are afraid, of the few moments when that knowledge might not hold. She moved her chair closer to the bars, she said, and it came out steadier than she expected. "I love you, Caleb Ironwood. I've known it for a while, and I've been choosing not to say it, because the situation is complicated, and the timing has been terrible, and I have a strong instinct toward not saying things I can't take back." He was very still. "But you're sitting in a 5'9" cell on my account," she said, "and I don't think timing is a luxury I can afford anymore." She reached through the bars. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers, and the bar was cold iron between them, and neither of them moved for a long time. He reached into his shirt pocket with his free hand. He held out the small cloth pouch she'd seen him touch, sometimes when he thought no one was watching, and he opened it and placed in her palm something small and white and precisely made an arrowhead, chipped from pale stone, still sharp at the edges, perfect in the way things made with total attention are perfect, he said. "My mother made this. She made it for the woman I would marry someday. She told me I'd know who deserved it." He closed her fingers around it. She was right. She usually was. Clara looked at the arrowhead in her closed hand. She looked at him through the bars. She said, "Ask me." He said, "Will you marry me?" She said, "Yes." Neither of them said anything else for a while. The lamp in the jailhouse corridor threw long shadows through the bars, and the cold came through the single high window. And she held the arrowhead in one hand, and his hand in the other, and the silence between them was the best silence she had found in 3 years. The silence of two people who have said the necessary thing and don't need to unsay it. Outside, the March wind came down off the mountains and moved through Kettle Ridge with its customary indifference, past the Silver Spur and past Dills and past the bank that held a piece of paper with Thomas Hadley's name forged at the bottom. And through it all, in the county courthouse 40 miles north, a ledger sat on a shelf with entries that told the truth about 1,878. And the truth was patient, the way truths are, and it could afford to wait a little longer. In February, when Teague filed the fraud case formally with the territorial court, he had secured in writing a standard procedural hold on any foreclosure action tied to the disputed account. The bank was barred from collecting on the Hadley debt, while the underlying fraud allegation remained before the court. This had brought them from the 15th of March to the 20th, 5 days that felt like borrowed air, and Clara had spent all 5 of them preparing for what came next. The morning of the hearing, Boone Kittredge came to the ranch before dawn. Clara heard the horse before she saw him, a single rider moving carefully in the dark, and she was at the door with the shotgun before the sound resolved into something she recognized. He reined up 10 feet from the porch and held both hands visible, and said her name with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been awake all night making a decision. She lowered the shotgun. She did not invite him in. She stood on the porch in the cold March pre-dawn and she waited. He said, "I've been working the thorn spread for 10 years. I know where every fence post is. I know which pastures flood in spring and which wells go dry in August. I know the books." A pause. "I know what's in the books that shouldn't be there." She looked at him. "The night the Hargrove barn burned," he said, Cobb Rook came back to the bunkhouse before sunrise with his coat smelling of kerosene and no explanation for where he'd been. He left his boots outside the door, the kind of habit a man gets when he doesn't want to track evidence across the floor. He reached into his saddlebag and produced something wrapped in burlap, a pair of boots, work-worn, the right heel, showing an asymmetric wear pattern that she recognized from the boot print in the snow beside the empty kerosene can on the morning after her chicken coop burned. I kept them. I don't know exactly why I kept them at the time. I think I knew even then that I was going to need to make a choice eventually, and I wanted to have something in my hand when I made it. She looked at the boots. She looked at him, she said, "Why today? Why not 6 months ago?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking honestly, the way a man does when the honest answer is not flattering to himself. Because 6 months ago I still believed Thorne was the kind of man who could be survived by people who kept their heads down and did their jobs. I believed that up until the night he told me to set the Hargrove fire, and I told him Delia was likely in the loft, and he said what he said. He looked at the burlap bundle in his hands. "I didn't set the fire. I told myself that was enough. It wasn't enough." She said, "Teague needs to know you're coming. I know, and you understand what this means for you. I understand." She let him water his horse at the trough, and she went inside and she stood at the kitchen table in the dark for a moment, her hands flat on the wood, and she thought about what it meant that the man who had stood 2 steps behind Thorne on the Silver Spur porch in October with his hand on his gun was now standing in her yard with a pair of incriminating boots and a conscience that had finally outrun his calculations. She thought about the particular arithmetic of people deciding, at the last possible moment, to do the right thing. She thought, late is not the same as never. She had learned that this year more than any other. She put coffee on. When it was ready, she brought a cup to the porch and set it on the rail without a word, and went back inside to dress. The March 20th hearing opened at 9 in the morning, and the Grange Hall was full before 8:30. Not just the usual observers, not just the parties and their counsel and the court staff. The hall had filled with the specific weight of a community that understood something important was happening and had chosen to be present for it. The same instinct that brought people to barn raisings and funerals and the kind of meetings where the shape of things gets decided. Clara counted faces as she made her way to the front table, where Teague was arranging his papers with the focused efficiency of a man who had been up since 4. She counted Josiah and Verna Ainsley in the 3rd row, their Sunday coats and their serious faces. She counted Nathaniel and Delia Hargrove, Delia sitting carefully upright with the posture of a woman whose lungs were still reminding her of February. She counted Doc Finn at the end of a bench with his bag under the seat. She counted Wesley Kerr and, 3 seats down from him, Otis Kerr, who had not looked at his son yet, but who was sitting in the same row, which was its own kind of statement. Caleb was brought in from the side door. The chains from the jailhouse had been removed by prior order, Teague having filed the relevant motion the previous week, and Stroud having granted it without particular comment. He walked to the chair beside Clara and he sat and he looked at the assembled hall with the measuring quality she had first seen in the Cocktober Square, the slow, deliberate inventory of a man who takes accurate account of his surroundings because accuracy has kept him alive. His eyes moved across the rows and found the faces that mattered and settled finally on her. She put her hand on the table between them, close enough to be intentional. He put his beside it, not touching, close. Before Stroud called the proceedings to order, Teague leaned toward her and said quietly that the county seat had responded to his written request for the corresponding bank ledger. The territorial banking law required all loans above $50 to be recorded in a corresponding ledger held at the county courthouse, a duplicate record maintained specifically to prevent exactly the kind of local manipulation that had been applied to Thomas Hadley's account. The clerk had certified the copy under seal and sent it by stage. It had arrived the previous evening. Teague patted the document case on the table beside his papers and said nothing further. And Clara understood that he was a man who had learned to deliver good news without ceremony, because ceremony invited the kind of hope that was expensive when things went wrong. Stroud called the session to order, and Thorne's lawyer, Aldrich, opened with the particular confidence of a man who believes the law is on his side, because he has read it carefully and has not accounted for what else might walk through the door. He described Clara as desperate. He described her as misguided. He described Caleb as an outside influence. And he said the phrase with the specific weight of a man who knows exactly what he is implying and wants the room to hear the implication without his having to take responsibility for it. Stroud looked at Aldrich over his reading glasses with the expression of a judge who has lived long enough to recognize the shape of an argument that is made of air, and he said to proceed with evidence. Teague went first with the ledger. He placed the certified copy on Stroud's bench and walked the judge through it with the patient precision of a man explaining something to someone intelligent who simply has not yet seen the relevant information. The entry was clear. June 14, 1878. Hadley Thomas. Account closed. Full settlement of principal and accrued interest. Signed and dated by the county clerk and countersigned by the corresponding bank officer, whose name was not Elmer Pruitt and whose signature was not forged. The entry existed in a record that Augustus Thorne did not control and had not had access to, which was the entire reason territorial banking law required the duplicate. The room absorbed this. Then Teague called Hortense Pruitt. She walked to the front of the hall in her good dress, with the expression of a woman who has made her decision and is not going to revisit it regardless of what it costs her. She was 48 years old, and she had been in this town her whole life. And the man she was about to testify against was her husband, and he was currently sitting in the rows behind her, and she did not look at him. She produced the tin from her bag. From the tin she produced 2 sheets of paper bearing multiple failed attempts at a signature, some crossed out, one abandoned mid-stroke, the final version circled in pencil by whoever had been coaching the effort. She explained, in the measured voice of a woman choosing accuracy over comfort, that her husband had written the fraudulent note at their kitchen table on an evening in October, that he had needed 4 attempts to produce a signature close enough to be usable, and that she had understood what she was witnessing and had said nothing. She said, "I kept quiet because I told myself it was his business and I wouldn't understand it anyway. That's what I told myself. What I understood was that a man was being framed and a woman was going to lose her land, and I stayed quiet because keeping quiet was easier than whatever the other thing was going to cost me." She looked at Stroud directly. "I'm done with the easier thing." Aldrich objected. Stroud overruled him with a brevity that contained, just barely, something that might have been impatience. Then came Doyle. He walked to the witness position in his formal uniform, the one he wore when he needed the office to be visible rather than just himself, and he sat and he folded his hands on his knee and he said, without preamble, that he had been advised by Augustus Thorne in the autumn of 1882 to process the Ironwood labor matter quickly and without close examination of the underlying facts. He said this clearly. He said Thorne's name without lowering his voice. He described the conversation at the Silver Spur, where Thorne had said, with the ease of a man accustomed to being heard, that the woman and her Indian were not going to last the spring. He described being told that the Ironwood matter had been handled as a favor, and that favors were remembered. He said, "I did what he suggested. I'm telling you now what I did and why. Because I've been wearing this badge for 22 years, and the only way I know how to keep wearing it is to tell the truth in front of people when the truth is what's needed." He reached into his coat. He placed his badge on the edge of Stroud's bench. He said, "If this county decides a man who let this go on as long as I did doesn't deserve to keep that, that's their right to decide. But I'm not walking out of here today having said less than everything." Stroud looked at the badge for a moment. He left it where it was. He said, "I'll hold your testimony for the record, Sheriff. Let's continue." The door opened. Kittredge came in leading 4 horses on rope lines, moving single file through the wide side entrance that Teague had arranged to be opened for exactly this purpose. The horses moved across the Grange Hall's plank floor with the careful wariness of large animals in an enclosed space, their hooves loud and deliberate, their breath coming in visible streams in the cold indoor air. They were chestnuts, all 4, with the deep-muscled, compact build of a quality Morgan line, and they were worth looking at, even by people who did not know what they were looking at yet. The room did not know what it was looking at yet. Stroud looked at Teague. Aldrich was on his feet. Thorne, in the second row, had gone still in a way that was different from his usual controlled stillness. a change Clara noticed and filed with the accuracy she had been developing all year for reading the specific signals of a man who believed he controlled outcomes. Kittredge stood beside the horses and said, without waiting to be asked, "These 4 animals have been on the thorn spread since the winter of 1879. They arrived during a hard freeze. No bill of sale was ever produced. I asked Mr. Thorne about it at the time, and he told me the provenance was handled and I should not ask again." He looked at Stroud. "I didn't ask again. I'm asking now, I suppose, by bringing them here." Teague asked Doc Finn to step forward. Finn came with the small implement from his bag, the same one he used for examining branded cattle at the request of ranchers disputing ownership, and he crouched beside the first horse and worked carefully at the left shoulder, clearing the winter coat in a small, precise patch. The thorn brand was there, the T inside its circle, burned into the skin years ago and healed to a permanent mark. And under it, visible when the light was right, and you knew to look, the ghost of an earlier brand that had been burned over, but not erased, the particular palimpsest of a hot iron applied to a place where another iron had already been, leaving 2 records in the same skin. 2 letters, overlapping but legible. T&H Thomas Hadley. Clara's hand found the horse's neck before she was fully aware of moving. She felt the animal turn its head toward her, felt the slow pressure of it, pressing its face against her shoulder, with the recognition of something that remembers what it belongs to, and she stood with her hand in the winter coat of a horse she had been told was dead, and she did not trust herself to speak, and she did not need to. The room understood what it was looking at now. Stroud examined the brand himself, rising from his bench and coming around to crouch beside the horse with the deliberate care of a man who understands that what he is seeing is going to be part of his record for the rest of his career. He looked for a long time. He stood. He looked at Thorne. Thorne's face was doing something that Clara had never seen it do before, not anger, not calculation, but the particular expression of a man who has run his models and found that the outcome has stopped matching the predictions, and who does not yet know how to operate in a world where that is true. Stroud said to Aldrich, "Does your client have anything he'd like to offer regarding the origin of these animals?" Aldrich said several things about provenance and record keeping, and the complexity of establishing certainty in livestock matters. Stroud's expression made clear what he thought of each of them. Then Kittredge said, from where he stood holding the lead lines, "Mr. Thorne told me the night before the fire at the Hargrove barn that I was to set it and make it look like the result of careless work. I told him I would not. I told him the reason was that Delia Hargrove was likely to be in the loft. He told me that in that case the timing was fortunate." He looked at the boots in Teague's hands, which Teague had taken from the burlap wrap during Kittredge's testimony. Cobb Rook set the fire. He came back to the bunkhouse before sunrise and left those boots outside the door. I kept them because I knew I was going to need to make a choice, and I wanted something in my hand when I made it. He looked at Stroud steadily. "I made too many of the wrong choices for too long. I'm trying to make the right one now while it still has some value." Stroud called a recess. An hour later he returned to his bench, and the hall was so quiet that Clara could hear the person 3 rows behind her shift their weight on the bench. Stroud said, "The debt note presented by Kettle Ridge Stockman's Bank is fraudulent. The corresponding county ledger establishes that the Hadley account was settled in full in June of 1878. The debt is void. The bank is hereby placed under territorial audit pending full examination of its records and practices." He looked at the certified copy on his bench. "The original charges against Caleb Ironwood are vacated. The horses currently present in this hall are established by brand evidence and witness testimony to be the property of the Hadley estate, now held by Clara Hadley, and are to be returned accordingly." He looked up at the room. "Augustus Thorne is remanded to territorial custody to answer charges of fraud, falsification of legal documents, theft of livestock, and conspiracy to commit arson. The bank is ordered to compensate Mrs. Hadley the sum of $412 in documented damages." He brought the gavel down. The sound of it filled the hall, and kept filling it, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling and the faces of 160 people who had come to watch something important and were now sitting inside the result of it. Caleb's hand closed over hers on the table. She turned and looked at him. And he looked at her. and neither of them said anything, because there were 160 people around them and everything that needed to be said was already in that one point of contact. In the specific warmth of it, in the fact that it was happening in public in front of everyone who had told her in October that she was making a mistake. Thorne was escorted out past the row where Nathaniel and Delia Hargrove sat. He did not look at them. He did not look at Clara. He looked at some fixed point ahead of him that no one else could see, and then he was through the door and gone. And the door closed behind him, and it was the most complete silence Clara had heard all year. 3 days later, Doyle came to the ranch on a Thursday morning with his hat in his hands. She knew before he spoke. She had learned, this year, to read the specific geometry of a man holding his own hat. It was the posture of someone delivering news that required him to carry his own discomfort visibly, to show that the news was costing him something too. He explained it carefully, the way he had learned to explain things to her this year, without softening and without theater. The fraud conviction was solid. The bank audit was underway. The livestock return was ordered. But the original labor judgment, the $85 that had started everything, the court order that predated all of it, had never been formally discharged. It existed as a separate instrument. The burning of the contract in November had been witnessed and recorded, but burning a document was not the same as satisfying the underlying obligation in a court of law, and the underlying obligation remained on the books with Caleb's name attached to it. Thorne's lawyer had located this fact in the 48 hours between the verdict and Thorne's transfer. He had purchased the obligation from the county court for exactly $85, the precise cost of a man's 2-year labor contract, and the purchase was procedurally clean. She stood on the porch in the March cold, and she looked at the fence line Caleb had built in October, straight and true, and she thought about the particular intelligence of a man who plans for losing, who holds one card in reserve specifically for the moment when everything else has failed, who spends $85 not because he needs the labor, but because the alternative is watching the woman who beat him keep the man she chose. She said, 72 hours. Doyle said yes. She thanked him. She waited until his horse was past the gate. Then she went inside and she sat at the kitchen table. And she did the arithmetic with the money she had, the $412 from the bank settlement, minus Teague's 20% contingency, minus the property tax that was due in 11 days, minus the operational costs of the next 2 months. She came up $22 short. She went to the barn. She stood at Storm's stall for a long time. The horse turned and looked at her with the patient, dark intelligence of an animal that has been returned to where it belongs and knows it. She put her hand on his neck and she said, very quietly, that she was sorry, and she meant it the way you mean something when the person you're saying it to cannot tell you it's all right. She went to the Ainsley place. Josiah answered the door, and Verna appeared from the kitchen, and the three of them sat at the table, and she said what she needed, and before she finished saying it, Verna had the tin from the pantry shelf on the table between them. $22. She took it, and she sat for a moment with the coffee Josiah had put in front of her, and she said, I need to ask something else. Josiah said, ask it. She told them what she was going to do. She told them what she needed from them. She used the word she had been avoiding all year, the word that required her to acknowledge that she could not do the next thing alone, and that asking for help was not the same as failing. She said, I need people to come tomorrow. I need them to come prepared. Verna looked at her husband. Josiah looked at Clara. He said, I'll ride tonight. She sent word through Wesley, who covered ground quickly and understood the assignment without needing it explained a second time. She sent word through Delia Hargrove, who had her own reasons and her own reach. She went herself to 3 other ranches before dark. She told each person the same thing. Come to the Grange Hall on Friday morning. Come prepared to do something that matters. That evening she went to the jail. The cell ceiling was 5 feet 9 inches, and Caleb was sitting on the bunk with his back against the wall, and his head tilted at the angle required to fit the space. She had not let herself think about what it meant to put a man of his height in a cell, built for ordinary dimensions, until she was standing outside the bars looking at him actually in it, and the anger that moved through her then was clean and cold and useful, and she let herself feel it, and then she set it down, because she needed to be clear for what she was going to say. She pulled the chair close to the bars and she sat. She said, trust me. He looked at her from across the bars with the directness that still, after 5 months, went straight through whatever she was using to keep herself composed. I already do, he said. That's settled, she said. Tomorrow is going to be unusual. He said most of our days have been unusual. She put her hand through the bars. He took it. She held the arrowhead in her other hand, the one his mother had made, which she had been carrying in her coat pocket since the night he placed it in her palm. She had not told him this. She told him now. He looked at the arrowhead in her closed fingers, and something moved across his face that she did not have a name for. Something that lived in the part of a person that does not get expressed in words, but in the quality of attention they give to a thing they care about. She said, I'm going to get you out of here. He said, I know. She said, I mean tomorrow? He was quiet for a moment. Then Clara, whatever you're planning, whatever it costs. It will cost what it costs, she said, and I'll pay it. The way you paid things this year, one thing at a time. She sat with him until the lamp in the corridor burned low, and the deputy made his rounds. And she rose and said good night, and he said her name, just her name, in the way he said things that mattered, and she carried that home through the March dark, and slept better than she had in a week. The Friday hearing opened at 9. The hall was fuller than Thursday. She did not know how that was possible, but it was true news in a small valley, travels through mechanisms faster than any individual message. And by the time she walked through the door, there were people standing along both walls and pressed too deep outside the windows. Stroud heard the legal argument first, because the law had to be heard before anything else could happen. Teague made the argument for vacating the contract transfer on the grounds of fraudulent context and improper enrichment. He made it well, and he made it honestly. And when he was finished, he looked at Clara and gave her the small nod of a man who has done everything available to him within the boundaries of his profession. Aldrich countered with the unambiguous language of contract law. The transfer was procedurally clean. The obligation was legitimate. The court's own order established it. He was correct. He knew he was correct. Thorne, in custody and present by order of the court for this proceeding, sat with his wrists in irons, and the expression of a man watching the last play of a game he had already decided he could win from any position. Stroud listened. He read. He asked 3 questions, each of which Teague answered and Aldrich answered, and the answers said the same thing from different directions, which was that the law as written did not give the judge a clear mechanism to void a legitimately transferred obligation. Stroud said, I don't have sufficient grounds under existing territorial code to invalidate this contract transfer. The obligation stands. He raised his gavel. Clara stood up. She reached into her coat pocket and she placed on the table in front of Teague $1, the last dollar she had without touching the property tax funds in the floorboard at home. She set it down and she looked at Stroud and she said, the obligation can be discharged by cash payment at any time, by any party. Your Honor, I'd like to begin. Stroud said, the total obligation with transfer fees is $87.50, Mrs. Hadley. I have $1, she said, but I didn't come alone. She turned and looked at the hall. Nathaniel Hargrove stood up from the 3rd row. He was a large man, and his voice was large, and it carried without effort to every corner of the hall. He said, $10. For the man who went into a burning building for my wife when I couldn't. Delia stood beside him and carried the bills forward. Josiah Ainsley stood, $15. And I want you to know, Caleb, that Storm has been in my barn since March eating my hay and being difficult about it, and you should come get him when this is done. He sat down and Verna stood and placed her contribution beside his without ceremony and sat back down. Wesley Kerr stood up. He had $3 and he placed it on the bench in front of him, and his face was the face of a 19-year-old man who has figured out who he wants to be and is doing the thing that proves it. Otis Kerr, sitting 3 seats down, watched his son stand and then stood himself and placed $12 on the bench without looking at anyone and sat down, and that was the entirety of his statement, and it was enough. Doc Finn from the end of a row, 10. And for the record, I haven't collected for treating a set of shoulder burns in February, so I consider us approximately even. Hortense Pruitt walked to the front of the room in the black dress, and she placed $8 on the table and beside them her wedding earrings, small gold drops that she had worn for 22 years. She went back to her seat. She sat with her hands folded, and she looked straight ahead. Horace Dill stood up. He was 47 years old. and he had said, "I don't serve your kind," to a man who had done nothing to him. And he stood up in front of a room full of people who remembered that, and he placed $7 on the bench, and he said, "I overcharged a woman who was barely keeping her land for 6 months, because I was afraid of what people would think if I treated her like any other customer. This is part of what that costs." He sat down and the room was very still for a moment, the still of people absorbing something honest. Amos Dre came forward with $1.25, which was everything in his pockets, and he placed it with the seriousness of someone who understands exactly what percentage of their total they are offering, and has decided the percentage is right. Then Marcus Doyle walked to the front of the room. He unpinned his badge from his coat and he set it on the table, beside the growing collection of bills and coins and one pair of gold earrings, and he put $5 next to it, and he said, "If the county decides a sheriff who waited too long to do the right thing doesn't deserve to keep wearing this, they can take it. But I'm not walking out of here having done less than I should have done. Not again." Others stood. People Clara had sent word to and people she had not. People whose names she barely knew and people who had been her neighbors for 3 years and had not spoken to her since October. Each one added what they had. The court clerk was counting at the table, running tallies, calling out the running total as it climbed, and the room had taken on a quality Clara had never experienced in a legal proceeding, a quality that was not exactly noise and not exactly silence, but the breath of people witnessing something they would describe to other people for years. The final count, $211.75, from 34 people. The clerk confirmed it. Teague placed the full amount on the bench. The room went quiet. Stroud looked at the money. He looked at the badge beside it. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the hall full of people who had come to do something that the law could not do for them, and had done it. He said, "The obligation of $87.50 is hereby satisfied in full by payment of record." He picked up his gavel. "Caleb Ironwood is a free man. This court's prior order established that. What this room has established today is something the court cannot order and cannot compel." He looked at the 34 people. "You've decided what kind of place this is going to be. That decision is yours. The court only records it." He brought the gavel down. Thorne was escorted past the rows of people who had just bought the freedom of the man he had tried to own. He said something. No one turned to hear it. The door opened and closed, and he was gone. And what was left in the hall was the particular quality of a room that has just done something it will spend years understanding. Clara stood at the front table, and she was not going to cry in front of 160 people, which she managed by the narrowest possible margin. Caleb stood beside her. Not behind her, not in front. Beside. He put his hand on her back, just briefly, just enough to say the thing that the room was full of people and he could not say directly. She felt it land. Josiah Ainsley said, from the third row, at a volume that carried without effort, "Storm is going to need exercising. I'm not running a boarding stable." The room laughed. It was the best sound she had heard all year, that laugh, because it was the sound of people who had been through something hard together and were discovering that they were still capable of it. The territorial audit of Thorne's bank ran through April and into May. The findings went further than Clara had known to anticipate. 9 other families in the valley had been subjected to variations of the same scheme. Fraudulent debts presented against settled accounts. Properties foreclosed on the basis of obligations that the county ledger showed had been paid. The governor's office sent 2 men to oversee the process, and the results were submitted to the territorial court in Helena. Thorne's sentence was 15 years in federal prison. Kittredge testified fully and received a conditional arrangement in exchange for his cooperation. The Rook brothers were tried separately and convicted, Cobb on the arson and Silas on assault, and neither of them would be in Kettle Ridge for the better part of a decade. The bank was reorganized under territorial oversight. The families whose properties had been wrongly taken were not all made whole. Some land had changed hands too many times to be simply returned, but the damages process gave several of them something, and the process itself meant that the valley understood, for the first time in years, that what Thorne had done had been seen and named and would not be done again in the same way. Doyle got his badge back by county vote in April. The margin was not close. Clara bought Storm back from Josiah in May with money from the bank settlement, paying the exact amount she had received for him, and not $1 less. because the transaction needed to be clean in both directions. Storm came home in the manner of an animal that considers itself to have been briefly inconvenienced and expects this to be acknowledged, which it was. On the 24th of June, under the cottonwood at the east edge of the yard, they were married. Reverend Isaiah Combs, 34, new to the valley and unacquainted with the recent history except in the form of its results, conducted the ceremony with the simplicity of a man who understood that the occasion required witness, not elaboration. Doyle signed as a witness, with the careful hand of a man who understood what his name on a document meant now in a way he had not fully understood before. The dress was cream-colored. Verna Ainsley and Delia Hargrove had spent 3 evenings making it and had strong and largely compatible opinions about the hemline. Clara wore the beaded necklace that had belonged to Caleb's mother, white and blue work that his mother had made and that he had carried for 7 years, for a purpose he had not been able to name until October. It lay against her throat in the June light, and she touched it once, briefly, before the ceremony began. The people who came were the people who had stood up. Some of them were people she would not have predicted in October. Horace Dill came and shook Caleb's hand and looked him in the eye when he did it. Otis Kerr came and stood in the same row as his son without the space between them that had been there in winter. Hortense Pruitt sat in the front row, and she was alone and she was present, and those were the 2 facts that mattered. The vows were short, because they had both said the important things already, in a jailhouse and a square and a hall full of people, and what remained was the formal acknowledgement of what was already true. Caleb said, "I came into this valley in chains in October. I'm standing here in June because you spent everything you had on a stranger, and then spent everything else making sure it counted. I don't have a word for what that is. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the right answer to it." She said, "You showed me that starting over isn't the same as giving up, that keeping something alive sometimes means letting go of what it used to be and trusting what it's becoming. I vow to trust what we're becoming, whatever it takes, for as long as it takes." Combs pronounced them married, and the cottonwood moved in the summer air, and the valley was quiet around them in the way it was sometimes quiet. Not empty but full of something that had no sound. After the guests were gone, and the evening had settled into the particular blue of a Montana June dusk, they sat on the porch steps, and the stars came out one at a time over the burtooths, and the ranch was quiet around them, the 9 horses in the barn, the fence holding, the garden past the worst of the season's uncertainty. She said, "I've owed you a question since October." He turned to look at her. "Your name," she said, "the one before the real one." He was quiet for long enough that she could feel him deciding, not whether to say it, but how to carry the saying of it after 7 years of not saying it. Then he spoke it in the language she did not know, the language that the mission school had beaten out of him, and that had survived anyway in some room in him that they could not reach. The sound of it was different from anything she had heard him make, lower and more his, a sound that had not been spoken aloud in 7 years. Then he translated it, standing in the storm. "My father named me the night I was born. There was a blizzard," he said. "I came into the world without any apparent concern about the weather, and he thought I should be named accordingly." She held this. She turned it in her mind the way you turn something to see it from every angle. She thought about October and November, and the long, terrible February, and the March morning, when she had stood at Storm's stall and said she was sorry to a horse. She thought about what it meant to be named for standing in what would break other things. "That's the right name," she said. She said it then, in his language. Imperfectly, with the pronunciation of someone who has heard a word once and is trying to honor it with the attempt. But she said it, and he heard it, and the thing that moved across his face in the June dusk was something she understood she had been the first person to put there in 7 years. He said, "My mother believed that a name only lives when someone speaks it, that a name without a speaker is a fire without air." He looked at her. "She would have loved you." "I've thought that since November." She leaned into the solid warmth of him, into the particular gravity of a man who had learned to hold himself steady through things that would have unsteadied anyone else. And she thought about what his mother had made and carried and given to a son, who carried it 7 years to this porch, on this June evening. And she thought that there were forms of love that moved through time, in ways that did not require the person to still be living. She said, "I'll say it every day." He said, "I'd like that." The night came fully down over the Hadley Ironwood ranch, and the valley settled into the deep quiet of a summer midnight. And the horses breathed in the barn, and the fence held in the dark. And somewhere in the east the first gray of morning was already considering its approach. In December, at the ranch's first Christmas dinner, Josiah Ainsley stood with his cup and looked around the table at the people who had spent a year becoming something together, and he said, "A year ago we gathered in a square to watch a sale. Tonight we're eating in the home of the man who was sold. I want to say plainly, while everyone here can hear it, that I was slow. I was slower than I should have been. The two of you moved first, and that's the only reason there was a second and a third." He raised his cup to people who make the hard choice before it becomes the easy one, because that's the only time it matters. The room said their names, both of them, together. Later, after everyone had gone home through the December cold, Clara stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the fence line visible in the moonlight, straight and true in the frozen ground, every post set right, every wire pulled taut, the whole line of it a correction that had been made with patience and a great deal of work, and no particular announcement. Behind her, Caleb moved through the kitchen, put things in their places, moving with the ease of someone who knows exactly where everything lives, which is the kind of knowledge that accumulates so gradually you don't notice it happening until one day it's simply true. She put her hand against the cool of the window glass. She said without turning, 14 months. He came to stand beside her. They looked out at the land together, the 200 acres that had been a wound and had become slowly a life. She said $85. His arm came around her. She felt him, the weight and warmth of the person beside her who had chosen every morning since October to stay. She turned her face toward the glass and beyond it, toward the Montana winter. Spread out under the moon, and she let herself feel the full measure of what they had built, which was not just a fence or a barn or a herd or a legal record, but the specific and irreplaceable fact of two people who had decided to trust each other in October and had found out, over 14 months of hard evidence, that the decision was right. He said, "Best $85 anyone ever spent." She said, "I've been thinking the same thing since October." The stars over Montana held their positions in the winter dark, the same stars that had watched the auction and the fire and the jail, and the hall full of 34 people standing up, and if they had opinions about the view from here they kept them, as stars do, entirely to themselves.